Hi, you're all.
Hey, how are you?
Hi.
Good afternoon.
Yes, it's the close afternoon, late afternoon.
Late afternoon.
Yes. How are you guys today?
Very well. And you?
Yeah, not bad, not bad. Not bad. Just had lunch with a friend. She got married in Singapore. I haven't seen her since then in January. So I just had lunch with her. It was good.
Oh,
Now I'm at school.
In school.
Yes, I'm
Oh.
preparing work.
Oh, okay.
But,
Which level
I
do you
can do
teach?
I'm not teaching. I'm preparing material for the students.
Ah, so like lab work and stuff like that, and you do their
Yes,
setup
yes,
and stuff like that.
yes.
Yeah. I know when I was a graduate student, I used to do that. They call it the teaching assistant sort of thing, and we had to do all the lab stuff for the university students when they go in microbiology. And I was like, okay, that's a lot of work to do. Yes, that is a lot of work to prepare.
Yes, but I'm rather free because I can decide how and when apply.
Okay, all right. So this is like junior high, or are they?
They are from 11 to 14 years old.
Yeah. Okay, junior high.
Lower
Yeah.
secondary.
Yes. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi,
Hello.
Stephen.
what's up, Stephen?
Hello. How's everybody?
Good.
Hey, Brian.
Good to
Alive and
see you.
kicking.
Well, we are moving through Unit 20. We have a little bit left to do there. We were talking about just some of the key issues that Paul was facing as he was trying to bring his gospel to the Roman world. And we noted that when he was going about proclaiming his message, that obviously he was running into obstacles with those who were promoting the worship of that time period with the different gods that were being followed. So as he was telling people that he didn't think that the gods they were worshiping really had anything behind them, obviously there were folks that weren't too happy with him because they were, people going up to the temple. There were people that were building these little idols they were worshiping. So he was creating a ripple effect all across some of these areas because it was deconstructing people's belief systems and also the businesses that were built up around these temples. What we're going to do with the rest of this unit is talk about another issue that he would have run into, and that is this idea of the food offered to the gods or food offered to idols. And this comes up particularly in the correspondence with the Corinthians. So we'll work on this, and then we'll be moving into Unit 21. So the issue of food offered to idols, we know that often when people butchered an animal, they had really two purposes for it. One was to offer up some of the meat into whatever temple where they were worshiping. And then, of course, they would consume the meat, at least part of the meat. So the animal, killing an animal, not everybody had that kind of money, didn't have that kind of those kind of resources. And so it was a pretty big deal, particularly if it was a larger animal. And so you would want to get kind of two benefits: the spiritual benefit by offering it to a deity of some kind, and then of course the physical benefit of actually eating the meat. What we know is that Paul runs smack into this issue because people wanted to know what's the rule, how are they supposed to respond when they're in a situation and there is meat that had been offered to an idol. Is this meat that can be consumed, yes or no? And so in Paul's responding to it, we get some interesting ideas that have been applied fairly widely to other contexts in life as well. So we start here in 1 Corinthians 8, 1-4, and he says this, that is Paul. Now, concerning things sacrificed to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Therefore, concerning the eating of things sacrificed to idols, we know that there is no such thing as an idol in the world, and there is no God but one. So that's a basic principle. But he indicates that this is something about having knowledge, and it's not a knowledge that everybody could have perhaps participate in or understand. because they're coming from a different point of view and have, been trained to think of idols as being real. So what happens if you have a group of people, a fellowship of people, a church of people, where there are some people who still feel like there's something going on when it comes to idol worship, and that eating meat to idols is corrupting? There's something that's harmful about it. Well, he goes on. For if there are these so-called gods, whether in heaven or earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet there is for us but one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and we exist for him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we exist through him. However, not all men have this knowledge, but some, being accustomed to the idol until now, eat food as it were sacrificed to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. So when they eat of this food, then they feel like there's that connection to the idol. And so it's creating a problem, even if there are those who are eating the meat and they're saying, it's not a problem for me because I don't think the idols are anything. And this is, the teaching that Paul was promoting. That's the deeper foundational teaching. But then there's the practical reality of how people are perceiving that when it's happening in their midst. So he says this as to moving towards a solution. For through your knowledge, he who is weak is ruined, and the brother for whose sake Christ died. And so by sinning against the brethren and wounding their conscience when is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause my brother to stumble. So the issue that he's dealing with is there's the base principle, there are no real idols, they're nothing, right? We know that from what we saw in some of the previous slides, and of course throughout Paul's letters. But if not everybody can fully embrace that reality, when somebody is eating this meat, it could cause them to stumble. It could be an issue where they are impacted by the way somebody else is participating in this process. And so Paul says, I'm not going to eat that meat if it's offensive to somebody else. He says it this way in Romans chapter 14. Do not tear down the work of God for the sake of food. All things are clean, but they're evil for the man who eats and gives offense. It is good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything by which your brother stumbles. The faith which you have is your own conviction before God. Happy is he who does not condemn himself in what he approves. But he who doubts is condemned if he eats, because his eating is not from faith. Whatever is not from faith is sin. So the freedom they would have based on the knowledge that the idols don't really exist cannot be used as an excuse to be unaware or not sensitive to how other people may be perceiving what's taking place. And you'll notice how he expands that in this particular passage. It's not good to eat meat or drink wine or to do anything by which your brother stumbles. So that's really kind of a Pauline principle. Sarah, please go ahead.
Okay. Jesus taught that in one of his sessions when he talked to the Pharisees, telling them that it's not what you take in that defiles you, but what comes out from you.
Mm-hmm.
And so applying that principle that Jesus has taught, it would actually coincide quite well here. And it's the only reason not to, it's consideration for the love of your brother, right? That you don't eat the food because it is not what you eat that defiles you, because everything belongs to God, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and Jesus was telling the Pharisees at one stage, look, it's not what that you take that will dirty you inside, because I kind of like clump them together, but I'm not. The Pharisees were saying that they had to wash all their stuff, and so Jesus says, no, whatever you take in, right, will not defile you. It's what comes out from the heart that actually shows what is evil or good in your heart, right? And so if you transport that principle over here, wouldn't that also support? Wouldn't that in the case of what Paul is trying to say, wouldn't that support that too?
I think there's some things that are connected in principle, but let me hold my comment. Crystal, do you want to jump in on this?
I've sort of always struggled with that too, and mostly because in Revelation, it's the church. It's Revelation chapter 2 that Jesus or Yeshua is speaking to the churches, and he gives this message is that he says this in verse 14, but I have a few things against you, which he's talking to Pergamos. He says, because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual morality. So, I mean, when I would try to balance that out with what Yeshua preferred and what Paul taught, trying to find that balance of Yeshua rejecting that, and Paul says, but I always looked at it sometimes as this way, as sometimes it's mercy over sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so I don't know, but that's a tough one. It really is.
Well, I think I mean, like going back to Sarah's observation, if you think about that context in Mark chapter 7, right? So particularly, Jesus is being criticized because his disciples are eating food without washing their hands, right? So the Pharisees thought that the ritual purity laws could be violated in that manner, and this is the way they were looking at it. You go to the marketplace or you're out and about and you're bumping into things, you're touching things that other people might have touched. Somebody could be ritually unclean. And we know from Levitical law, there's lots of things that can cause that. So if you were to touch something ritually unclean, whether you knew it was unclean or not, and then you were to eat, then that would make you basically unclean all the way through. And so they thought the best way to protect against that was to do this ritual cleansing, which they really borrowed from temple practice. It was really the practice of the priests to do this ritual washing, right? So they basically took temple practice, brought it into the home, made it a part of the table fellowship. So in that context, what Jesus is talking about is, as we noted before, is not kosher food versus non-kosher food. It's talking about eating kosher food with hands washed or hands unwashed, right? And so that's where his real dispute with them was. Now, in this context, with Paul, there is, of course, a debate among scholars as to when he says all things are clean, is he saying all foods are clean, or what does he mean? Does he mean clean in the sense of not connected to demons, or is he applying that across the board? And there's a debate, right? We've talked about that. Some think that in the early Christian church, the Jewish believers did keep kosher food law, and they did that even amongst Gentiles by just making food choices, right? So you go to somebody's table and you pick and choose what food you want, so that he didn't violate kosher food law. Others say, no, he did, because in order for him to fully participate with Gentiles, he would have had to. So there's a debate, and so I'm not sure we can resolve that in this instance. I think in this instance, the principle has more to do with being aware of the other person, right? So in the context, in the way I understand, in the context in which Jesus is speaking, that has to do with each person individually and how you can become unclean. And as Sarah noted, Jesus was very clear. The way that happens is you have something in your heart and it comes out from within you, right? So evil thoughts become speech, become action, and that's really how you defile yourself. So I couldn't possibly do that by accidentally bumping into something and then not washing my hands. So he's just got a different point of view about the way the Pharisees are processing that. But I think in Paul's case, he's coming at it not so much from a ritual purity angle. He's asking the question, when you eat and drink, why are you doing it? And are you aware of how other people are perceiving your consumption? Because if when you're eating and you're drinking, you're doing it in such a way that somebody is being offended by it and you're not paying attention to that, than you should. So liberty, this is kind of interesting, part of Paul's teaching. Liberty for Paul is the liberty of faith that he talks so much about is not an allowance to just do whatever you want, right? Liberty and faith is that you have this relationship with God that doesn't require, keeping a number of laws and, the pathway that was more the works of the law pathway. But what it does do, if it's properly understood, is it releases the spirit inside of you that should make you more loving and caring towards others. So you may not have the restrictions over on this side, but you should have an internal sense of how your behavior could impact somebody else. So you purposely limit yourself in certain areas because you know it could be harmful. Right. So it'd be like somebody, let's say you're at a table and wine's being served, or let's say you're at a table and you're ordering a meal and a friend comes in. And let's say that you were planning on ordering a glass of wine, but your friend is someone who struggles with the issue of alcohol. So they come and sit down, you start to have your meal, and you decide not to order the wine. I think from my way of thinking, that's kind of what Paul is saying is, but in his context, it is expanding into meat, it's expanding into other things. You're around somebody who maybe has just come out of idol worship, may just come out of all of these superstitions that were a part of that, and understand that that was scary for them, right? People coming out of that would have been afraid that they were offending these powers, these dark forces. And so they would be nervous about it, right? They'd be scared about it. And so letting them kind of get deeper in their faith, more mature in their faith, where maybe at some point they will have that knowledge that there's really nothing there. But in the meantime, they'll feel that there's something there. It'll be hard for them if they see you eating that meat. So I'm sure this is a key principle for many people, just being aware of somebody else and how our behavior impacts them. So even if a behavior may be neutral for us, it may be harmful for somebody else. And that sensitivity is a sensitivity that I think Paul believed would come through the power of the Spirit, right? That's what that freedom wasn't a freedom just to live however you want, but a freedom to limit yourself because you're aware of the other person. Okay, so this is a great Paul's principle in this area, I think, is really beneficial. It's one that can be helpful in so many different avenues of life. And it's just, a lot of it's just, having your eyes open and noticing your neighbor, noticing their reaction to the way we do things. I remember years and years ago when I was teaching I taught a college for about 20 years, and I had a grad student from Ethiopia, and we were going to a meeting or a conference or something, and we went through a drive-through. We got a meal, and I didn't think about it. I was going to do my American thing. I was eating and talking and driving, and and he was sitting there looking at it, looking at the meal, and I said, I thought, oh, did I buy something? Did I not order? He said, no, it's fine. I said, well, is everything okay? And he goes, well. He said, I don't want to make a big deal about it, but the money you just spent on that meal is like less than one day's wages for, many of the people that I know. And I was like, oh, okay. And it took me back. And I just thought, I was so grateful. I learned so much from him because he taught me that, different parts of the world, the way we look at money, the way we look at, food. I mean, here I'm just kind of, not really paying attention. And he's drawing my attention to the fact that, it's not easy for a lot of people to have food. It's not easy for a lot of people to navigate. Life's hard in certain places. And he was being aware of it and I wasn't, right? So I was so great. I learned so much from him. It was I learned probably more from him than ever from me. So yeah, Dale, go ahead.
Yeah. And this whole issue is very relevant in my culture. In that in Trinidad, we have people who including myself, who came from a Hindu background. Okay, so I am very aware of the reasoning and the what it is meant when certain foods are prepared, right?
Mhm.
For instance, we eat bread and drink wine. That's normal, but it's communion when it's done in church, and it
Mhm.
carries a different significance.
Mhm.
So if somebody who is not a believer and they just want to sit in church and partake of it, then it's not just about the carbohydrates and the alcohol, right? It's
Mhm.
it's there is a significance behind it. So if for instance somebody has a Hindu prayers and they like, it could be my relatives, right? And if it is because it's somebody's birthday and they choose to have this prayer, so I visit for the birthday, but then they serve food, right? That's part of the birthday. I have no problem with that.
Mhm.
But if they symbolically presented something to their gods, and when you partake of it, it symbolizes your allegiance
Uh-huh. Yeah.
to
Symbolizes
that
and
faith. I will
Yeah.
not partake of it, even
Mhm.
though it is flour and
Sure.
beans,
Sure.
whatever,
Yeah.
right? So it is not about the constituents or something like that. But so, and I'm a believer since 1983, right? That so it and I am fully aware of all these things, but it is not just about how it impacts them, but what it means to them,
Mhm.
and I am still going to partake of it, then
Mhm.
I don't want to be unfaithful.
Yeah, yeah. So that's interesting. Thank you for that. So that's kind of looking at it from the other angle, right? So, here you're not partaking because of the witness that it is, and then that the loyalty you have. Thank you for that. I think that balances it out very nicely. Well, let's push on a bit here as we come to the end of this unit. Certainly, we know that there were aspects of Paul's message that would have, kind of rubbed up against people wrongly. And whether we're talking about the issue of, going up to temples for prayer and the idols and all that's behind that, or the issue of food, we know that there would have been some who would have seen him as a Jewish man walking in their midst, presenting a Jewish message, and there would have been pushback. And certainly throughout the book of Acts, we see that happening. And so when we read Paul's letters, we see him wrestling with that. So many Pauline scholars have referred to him as the practical theologian or the pragmatic theologian, right? So he talks about very deep and profound ideas, but always for the purpose of helping people to live out their faith in important ways. So he's having to push through these cultural issues, but he was raised in Tarshish of Cilicia. He was raised in the diaspora, right? It wasn't that it's probably surprising to him of what he had to go up against, but the intensity of it, I'm sure, was overwhelming at times. He spent a number of years in prison off and on, and had to really carry that load as he was trying to make this message um, available to the Gentile world and understandable, and then something that they could utilize in everyday life, and then go on and be successful in their faith. As Paul, as his ministry comes to an end, he's beheaded by Nero in the Neronian persecution, and as the Jewish-Roman War takes off, and you see a change in the leadership of the way, and now it becomes much more Christian, more of a Christian, group, more Gentile. Then that need to kind of stay connected to the Jewish roots became less and less important, as we've talked about. And so the message that was preached later on becomes much more tailored to a Gentile audience, and some of the Jewish aspects concerning anything related to food law, or feast or festivals or Sabbath keeping, all that started to fade away. And so that's a big part of how the church started going more onto its trajectory into the Gentile world. Okay, so let me go ahead and move this over. Any questions or comments as I'm transitioning to the next unit? Okay, so this next unit is focused on the idea of monotheism versus polytheism, and whether monotheism, polytheism are the best terms that we can use for what's taking place in this period, or if perhaps there's another term that we should consider. So there's a bit of a debate among scholars, and we have a slide that will refer to this as to whether or not it's even accurate to talk about monotheism when you're looking at the ancient Near East, or you're looking at, the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, because that term is, a term that's developed quite a bit later. And so the term itself coming later, the conceptualization of it, is that something you can take and then apply to something that happened, hundreds of years before? And so that's part of what's happening in this conversation is, what are the theisms of antiquity? What can we say about them? What do we have to acknowledge when it comes to looking at passages in which it appears other deities are, understood to exist, particularly in light of what we just said about idols, and then looking at how people understood the gods at that time, their connection to particular people groups, their ethnicity, and then also the idea of them kind of creating families around themselves, with the rulers of each nation often seen as the sons of the gods. So the theisms of antiquity, we begin with the reality that we do have a tension already in the Hebrew Bible, and that is the use of the plural noun Elohim for God. So this word here, the im ending here, is a masculine plural. And so it's a little bit confusing when you encounter it in the Hebrew Bible, because we think of God as singular, and even the Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. The whole kind of cry of ancient Israel is the oneness of God. So why is he referred to in the plural? Well, part of the answer is that it's in reference to a competing system. So there is a phrase, Elohim Acherim, and that's translated as other gods. So the theological system that later became known as polytheism was the standard operating belief at that time. And so whenever you encounter Elohim in reference to a polytheistic belief system, there is an adjective, and the adjective is acherim, which is other. And so you have one theological system, which is there is a god or goddess for about any aspect of life or the environment, from sunshine to rain to controlling of storms to fertility to war to, there were hundreds of deities. And so the Elohim Acherim system is that my best approach, if I'm going to be spiritual, is to identify the most powerful deities that are responsible for these different aspects that will influence my life, and worship them and try to get them on my side. And then you have the other system, the system that was advocated by the ancient Israelites, and that is the Elohim, who is somehow one, somehow magnificent and plural in capacity, that he can cover all things, but should not be understood as needing different aspects or different other deities to make sure things get accomplished. So this is what we find in the Hebrew Bible, and we encounter the theological and really grammatical issue right up front. It's in the very first sentence of the Hebrew Bible. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. And the reason we have an issue right away is that the verb bara is singular. So there is subject-verb agreement in biblical Hebrew. And so Elohim is plural, but the bara is singular. So it'd be like saying in English, they is. It would sound wrong, right? It's the subject and the verb don't agree. That's what it looks like. And then as the book unfolds, as the Torah unfolds, you start to realize more and more that there's something taking place here. We know there are plural self-references. For example, in Genesis 1:26, and God said, "Let us make mankind in our image." So the plural self-references seem to reflect the plurality of the word. And even later in Genesis 3, when it's a reference to the divine name, the man has become like one of us, right? So you do have these plural references. So if you look across the spectrum of biblical commentary, you have lots of options for understanding it. So one interpretive option is it's the royal we. So when you have someone as great as God, he would never refer to himself in the singular, just as a great king would not. Another view is that one God who covers all things. You could never refer to the creator of the universe, who's responsible for everything we see, in a singular form, right? So this would be the Elohim Acharim are over here, and the Elohe Yisrael is over here, single creator, many deities. They're just two different theological systems. I have seen some commentary that think that the reference of "let us make mankind in our image" is a reference to God and the heavenly host, or God and the angels. And then, of course, the Christian view that developed later is that of the Trinity. Now, the word Trinity does not occur in the Bible. It's not a biblical term. It's more of a philosophical term that was used by some of the early church fathers as they were having conversations about how to describe Jesus. Now, we know that there were many different views about Jesus as that was going through the first century, second century, third century. You had the Gnostics who believed that Christ was a spirit that kind of took over the body of a man named Jesus, and that its role was to speak divine truth, to have knowledge, right? So Gnosticism is based on the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. So his job was to speak divine knowledge, and if you understood the knowledge, then you were saved. So salvation comes through knowledge. That was the Gnostic view of Jesus. You had a view of kind of an adoptive view of Jesus, that Jesus became God's son when he was baptized, and it said the Spirit coming out of heaven and came upon him. That's when he became the Son of God. So that was the adoptionist view. But the two views that, as you get closer to when it finally gets settled, that were in competition was that he's fully God and fully man at the same time, which was the Trinitarian view. And then there was a view by a bishop named Arius who believed Jesus was half God and half man. He was like right in the middle. And so Arius's view was very popular, and the Trinitarian view was popular. And so early Christianity had a fairly significant debate going on until the early part of the 4th century, early 300s. And that's when Constantine, who was the Roman general who became the Roman emperor, when he decided to make Christianity a legal religion, he didn't want that. They were actually fighting in the street in some instances about Trinitarian view versus the other view. So he called the Council of Nicaea and he settled it. And the way he settled it is he used the Greek word homoousia. Homo means one or same, and ousia is a Greek participle, means being, same being, later got translated as same essence. So 3 persons, 1 essence, right? That was really became the formulation of the Trinity. So that conceptualization, once it was agreed upon at the council, that became kind of the leading idea from that time forward. And then, of course, subsequent commentators, when they read these passages, that's the lens through which they read them. So this issue of the plurality of the name and the singularity of the verb in Jewish tradition is more along the lines of this view here, the one God who covers all things. So, obviously you have different points of view when it comes to how to understand that. What we do know is that these terms, polytheism and monotheism, as I mentioned before, are later developed terms. And they do make a lot of sense, right? Monotheism is a belief in one God, and polytheism is referencing to, worshiping many gods simultaneously. And I do think that generally speaking, even though those terms are created later, you can still take them back into an earlier time and somewhat describe them or use them in a descriptive way. The issue is that there's other passages that are a little different, where it talks about the need to worship one God in the context in which there are other gods that are being worshiped, right? So there's another term that's been created in that reference. Someone who feels like perhaps the issue of monotheism has been misapplied is this scholar named Richard Bauckham. And he says the term monotheism has become problematic and potentially misleading. The set of ideas it evokes are characteristically enlightened ones, seducing us into reading the biblical writings in terms of a view of religion that belongs to the Enlightenment. In other words, taking a concept that's developed in the 1700s, 1800s, and then taking it back earlier and trying to make it fit. And he says he doesn't think that's really quite fair. Deo, go ahead.
Yeah. So we are told, well, in the Torah, right? You shall worship no other God, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when Abraham was sitting in his tent and the angels of God came, Abraham went flat and worshiped, it says, right? And before, and you know how it goes, right?
Mhm,
Where he
mhm.
prepares the meals and so on. But he worshipped, and it would be described as the angel, which was wrong to worship an angel of God. So
Mhm.
how do you explain that in terms of God, God being separate, and this is someone like in a human form, because how do you address that, or how is that consistent with what we are seeing here? That's one. And then there's the other aspect in Psalm 82 where it refers to the divine counsel, right? But let's deal with this first one first.
Well, it's a good question. It's hard to know. We don't have much, we don't have much of Abraham speaking about his view, right? So all we really have are just some of the bits and pieces. What we do know is that when biblical characters encounter what they think is a manifestation of some kind of the divine, they often do go to their face. Whether you're talking about, Moses at the burning bush or Abraham in the context that you're talking about. So when it becomes to their mind that they're encountering something representing the divine, that creates that place of humility. And so I think that would probably be how I would answer that initially. It's certainly true that some see the three beings in that story as two angels and Jesus, right? That's often how that's understood. In Jewish tradition, it's understood as three great angels, and that each angel has a different duty. So one angel has come to announce the birth of a child in a year through Sarah, and the other two angels are going to Sodom and Gomorrah. One of them is going to rescue Lot, and the other one's going to bring about the destruction. Either way, you would have a sense of a theophany. You'd have a manifestation of God through somehow the appearance of these three. Now, how Abraham processed that, I don't know for sure, but he certainly would appear to recognize in them a manifestation of God. And of course, later we know that, and it's kind of unclear whether they're still there or he seems to be more by himself. He has a conversation with God about whether Sodom and Gomorrah should be destroyed, if there are 50 righteous, if there are 40 righteous. Yeah.
But we see in other cases where people bow to worship angels and the angels say, don't worship me, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But that was not in this case here, right?
Yeah, I think that's a fair analysis. But again, what Abraham was processing and the way he looked at it, that would be hard for me to say. Given his context and his situation. What we do know is, like I said, there's a transition in that story to where he is somehow conversing with God. And you have the same sort of unusual experience with Jacob wrestling with the angel, right? There's a sense in which he's wrestling with someone, and then there's a conversation that takes place, and then he comes away saying he saw God face to face, right? So, you know, there are certain aspects of some of these stories that, you know, there's kind of a difference between systematic theology and biblical theology, right? So systematic theology is trying to get everything fitting nice and neat. Biblical theology is a little harder to do. There are stories and details that don't always fit. That's why biblical theologians kind of go book by book, trying to look for patterns. Systematic theologians are looking at the bigger picture and trying to see how it all fits together. So, you know, sometimes cases are made and they seem pretty strong, and sometimes maybe less so. So this issue of theisms, polytheism, monotheism, where one gets added is henotheism, which is probably closer to at least some of the passages, particularly in the Hebrew Bible, where it's acknowledged that other gods exist, at least they're being worshipped, but people are supposed to worship only one. Another term that you'll often find is monotheistic or monotheizing. Monotheizing would be encouraging people to worship one God within the context of other worships, whether other people worshiping many gods. So the idea that all gods exist, not surprising, we find passages like this in the Hebrew Bible. People are interacting with cultures where clearly there are temples and there are priests and idols everywhere. But in Exodus 23, it says, you shall have no other gods before me. So even if there are other ones out there, or they're being worshiped, they cannot be put before God. For a Lord is the great God of the great King above all gods, right? So again, seems to acknowledge that they do exist. Worship him, all you gods, Psalm 97:7. Exodus 15:11, who is like you among the gods, O Lord, who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in praises, and working of wonders. So what do you do when you're in a context where you're wanting to worship the one who made all things, and you're not supposed to worship anything else, and yet your neighbors are, right? So I think that's kind of the issue they were facing as they were trying to move forward. Now, what's interesting in this passage is if you compare the translation of the Septuagint to what's happening from the Masoretic text, you can see in Exodus 22:28, you shall not curse God nor curse a ruler of your people. You can see how that's being translated from the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text. Look what happens in the Septuagint. You shall not revile the gods, the us, which is plural, or speak ill of the ruler of your people. So when the translators of the Hebrew Bible into Greek did it, they translated this in a plural. They did not translate it in singular, which is interesting and tells us something about their context and their situation. It kind of coincides with what we find in the writings of Philo, an early Jewish writer who lived in Alexandria and probably had a copy of the Septuagint. And he says you got to be careful about, you don't curse the gods, because the rulers of those areas often saw themselves as sons of the gods. So if you curse the gods, you're cursing them. So, be careful, So it's interesting how, people were being careful, somewhat like what Paul is suggesting, right? You have sensitivities, but you also have leaders who are sensitive as to how, their gods are being referred to. This is another interesting passage. For all the gods of the peoples are idols. No, it's a little different word here. Elohim, not Elohim. But the Lord God made the heavens. Now in the Septuagint, there's a movement to a different word. For all the gods of the heathen are daimonia, devils, but the Lord God made the heavens. Now there's some interesting literature. There's an article in the Jewish Virtual Library about demons and the understanding of demons. You don't really have much in the Hebrew Bible. You have this odd reference the story of Noah about the sons of God having relations with the daughters of men, and then there's the Nephilim that show up. That seems to be something happening there. Some think that the sons of God reference are fallen angels. Then you have the passage in 1 Samuel where you recall Saul has an evil spirit that comes upon him, right? So we have a few scattered references about the idea of a demon or a fallen angel, but it isn't really till you get between the fall of the first temple and the fall of the second temple, in that period, that you see a movement towards not just two competing theological systems, one God over all or many gods, but now you start to have a subset of evil spirits. And some think that might have developed through Jewish interaction with Zoroastrianism. So the Persians believed there was a primary God for good, and there was a primary God for evil, and that there were, subordinate spirits that were helping each side. And that when you get into Jewish apocalyptic writing, you start to see this idea of fallen angels develop. So instead of saying that you have kind of a make-believe system of other gods, that there may be something supporting the worship of these other gods, and those could be these fallen angels, right? So the way of understanding this would be to say that whatever was happening supporting the worship of Artemis or whatever, or Zeus or whatever, that demons would have this capacity to encourage this through their trickery and their suggestions in people's hearts and minds. So it is interesting that, the Septuagint, we think of being translated in 3rd century BCE, how it's moving from kind of this generic idols, which really has more to do with the figurines, to something maybe behind the idols, this idea of demons. Yeah, Nandeo, go ahead.
Yeah. So when I read, say like I'm reading from Isaiah about the people and they worship their idols from the rivers with the smooth stone and so on.
All right.
But in the what I came from before, in some of the idols and some of the deities that I was involved in worshiping, I see a lot of those things, similarities in the Old Testament, right? So of course we know that the culture and so on could have extended all the way to India and so on, right? But I am careful not to just assume that it developed with maybe different views later on. I see when I read it from all those Old Testament scriptures, I see the relevance to what holds now, So and I'm taking that this is from that times of Abraham and Moses and so on. So then there is the physical evidence of the manifestation of these things, which I have witnessed, and I'm a scientist, okay? So I'm very careful not to, just attribute maybe emotions or stuff like this. And I have seen those things, not just in Trinidad, but I have seen it in the jungles in South America and so on,
Well, yes, I can see what you're saying. If you look at the drawings or the figurines of some of these, there's a lot of similarities even as you go from culture to culture. And then, of course, when you get to the New Testament, you have exorcisms. You have, individuals coming at Jesus, and then he's able to cast out what's ever in that person. Yeah. And it's not just Jesus. You have Jewish exorcists that are talked about in rabbinic literature. Antonella, please go ahead.
I want to ask you something about a letter of Paul in the Galatians. He admonishes us not to invite demons to the God's table. What is the real sense of this to our day?
What is the reference? What is the reference?
I think it was in the Galatians, but I'm not sure. But I know I picked this this morning because I don't know how I came across this letter, but I was stricken by this thing, and I thought to myself, what is the sense? Because to invite a demon is to invite something that is not pertinent to our seeking knowledge. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's a difficult thing to get into because you have, so many different perspectives on it. The biblical text and the Hebrew Bible, there's these quick references here and there. Then we get into the New Testament, and it just seems like Jesus is in a war, right? He has individuals coming at him. He casts out demons. There's one in which they kind of resist him. There's a legion apparently in one individual, and he allows them to come out and go into the pigs, as you recall. So there seems to be a spiritual war. And as we go into Paul's writings, he seems to think so too, right? So Paul picks this up and he refers to the spiritual warfare and, the idea of a leader guiding them, a Satan figure. Some of the writings have Belial is referred to. He's referred to in the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. And even in the rabbinic literature, there's this sense of these spirits that are, around and you have to ward them off through, different amulets and different incantations and so forth. So you have this interesting kind of a reality in which there's, I think, generally a sense of there's one God over all things, but there's something else happening. There's something else happening, and it's unclear, even when you look at some of the text, as to what exactly is happening. Now, you do have the passage in Revelation 12 where it talks about the devil, bringing down, a third of the stars, which are, fallen angels. You have the passage in Genesis 6 that seems to imply that there are beings on earth that should not be on earth. And how are you, the cultures and the religions that take that seriously are asking the question, how do you keep them off of you? How do you protect yourself against them? And, I've encountered people that deal with that, it's a very serious thing for them every day, and others that don't think it's something of significance, and people of good faith in both camps. I think that you certainly have, and let me go a little further here, you certainly have passages, there are references that if there's nothing there, it's hard to make sense of, right? Mm-hmm. So when Paul says there are really no gods behind the idols, I think he's talking about, deities, but he clearly can't be talking about something else, because we have him casting out demons in the book of Acts. What's he casting out? Right. So when he has that lady who apparently can tell the future, does some divination, and she's kind of hounding him, he just turns to her and casts the demon out. Well, that doesn't even make sense. And then there's passages where he seems to, in his own letter, seems to be talking about something that's going on. So let's take a look at this. So he acknowledges, although he kind of downplays it, even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many gods and lords, yet for us there is but one God, the Father, and one Lord. Here's how he says it: the so-called gods, legoimenoi theoi. So he's saying they are called gods. They are being called God. It's a passive participle. So as indeed there are many many gods, many lords. So he's, we know if you read Paul, you kind of get a sense of him. He certainly has a rhetoric that he uses. So he's kind of saying, yeah, there are many gods and many lords, but ultimately there's only one. So he's acknowledging that other people think differently than he does, but he clearly has a specific purpose. But now, having said that, there are other passages where he seems to think or indicate there's something else out there. And he says this in 2 Corinthians 4. Even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing, in whose case the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelieving so that they may not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is in the image of God. So the God of this world, in the Greek, it's hotheos to ionos, the God of this age, hetuphlosen, has blinded the minds of the apiston, the unbelieving. Right, so that implies a pretty active force, and it implies an external force. It's not simply people within their own sense doing things, but something is making it harder for them to see. And I don't know if you remember, I'm sure you do, the parable of the 4 types of soil that Jesus tells. And you remember he talks about the soil that fell on the rock, on the hard path, and the birds come and eat it. But do you remember what he says that is? What does that represent?
So Satan comes and takes it away.
Yeah, it takes it away, right? So before the word can take root, it's plucked out of their mind. And you've probably been in a situation like this. I know I have, where you're having an important conversation, all of a sudden somebody gets distracted and they're off into something else, right? And it really has that kind of feeling like you're about ready to have an important conversation, and all of a sudden, they're gone, right? Their mind just went somewhere else. Well, he has another passage, and this is really kind of the spiritual warfare chapter. You remember the armor of God. He talks about putting on the armor of God in Ephesians chapter 6. And then he says, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Now, in the book of Daniel, you have this sense of spiritual warfare, right? And apocalyptic literature has this sense that in order for a holy person on earth to receive a message from God, they kind of have to break through this barrier of evil forces, and that the powerful angel has to bring that message to earth. And so, again, it's really unclear where these forces come from. Some brief references here and there. Systematic theologians have worked to try to identify these bits and pieces, and probably the most common is they're fallen angels, right? That there are angels who have decided, under the leadership of a great angel named Lucifer, that they don't want to serve God anymore. They want to be served, and that either at the moment of humans' creation they fell away, or they fell away a long time before that. So there's 2 big theories, and I'm sure there's more, but 2 that I'm aware of. One is that when the serpent tempts Adam and Eve, that's the moment that Satan first fell. That he was jealous that there were beings created that were greater than he was, because humans are made in the image of God. So that prompted him to try to disrupt this relationship by coming down and tempting humans to turn away from God and to worship him, to follow his word and not God's word. And that's when he fell. He fell at that moment. Now, there's another view going back into Genesis 1, and it would say that if you look at the way that story begins, there is an earth that has water and darkness, and then God says, let there be light, like there had been something there before that maybe had fallen. And that perhaps this war between this fallen being and God had been going on for some time. So that when God creates the garden and he puts man in the garden, the first thing he says to Adam is to till it and to guard it. The word is shamar in Hebrew, to guard the garden. And then he puts in the garden the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, like there's already something going on, and that Adam and Eve are going to have to address. that there's already a war taking place. So those are two theories that I'm aware of. One is there's been a fallenness from some past creation, perhaps, and the other one is there's a fallenness at the kind of close to the moment of human creation, in which this being, does its thing. But not everybody agrees on that. Some look at the story of serpent and see they don't really see evidence of that. The serpent is cursed. The serpent is, stripped of his capacity to walk upright, and it seems to be all part of that. So, in Jewish way of thinking, you really can't have any competing beings, because that would create more of a polytheistic structure. So you don't really have that whole scenario. Doesn't really work. What you have is people being empowered to choose good or evil. That's really what that story is about. You have the good inclination and you have the evil inclination, which was external and became internal in the so-called fall, right? So when you look at rabbinic literature, they spend a lot of time talking about you have two inclinations, one inclination to do what's good and one inclination to do evil, and you have to fight. You have to study Torah, you have to pray, and you have to work against the evil and embrace the good. Well, we're pretty much out of time, but Namdev, go ahead.
Yeah, it's just that I wanted to get your view on in the book of Job when it talks about the accuser, who obviously had access to the throne of God. Whether that could have been just a good angel, but his function is to be the accuser, or is it Satan as the fallen angel?
Well, it's a good question. So you have a couple competing theories there. One is that he is a rogue angel and he still has access to the throne because Jesus hasn't defeated him yet. So some would take the throne scene in Job 1 and connect it to Revelation 12, right? That Satan, even though he's a rogue angel, has access to the throne until Jesus' death on the cross, which defeats him on such a level that he can no longer go to heaven. And so he's shut out. So if you go to Revelation 12, it talks about him being cast down. The Son is taken up and he is cast down, right? So you have some who would connect him, that story in Job 1 to Revelation 12. And so that would be a particular kind of reading. The Hebrew text in Job takes it a little different direction. The word Satan is not a proper noun. It's not a name. It is actually based on a verb. The verb is the same. It's Satan. It means to accuse. And so in the book of Job, it is not Satan. It's Satan. It is the accuser.
Yeah.
And so some would say that he is just doing his job. And if you look at that story closely, it talks about sons of God again. That's the one other place it shows up in Job 1 and then in Genesis 6. It really doesn't occur maybe once in the Psalms. And what it says is basically God asks, you remember, he asks, where you've been. And then he says, if you consider my servant Job. Now we have a reference, and I can't remember the exact verse, but it's in Zechariah. It talks about patrolling angels, that they go out and kind of check out the world. It's like the two angels that go to Sodom and Gomorrah. Are they at a place of judgment, yes or no? And so some think that what's happening in the Job scene is you have angels, including Satan, whose job is to go and check out humanity and see if we deserve the blessing that God has given, and that he was just doing what God assigned him to do. He's like a prosecuting attorney, and that's what he's just doing his job.
Still being in the kingdom of God, that is.
Mm-hmm. So from the Jewish point of view, anything in that context has to be so much below God, right? Everything else is way down below, and humans still have to be given the capacity to overcome. And so in the rabbinic literature, the capacity to overcome is embedded in study of Torah and doing good deeds and prayer. Those are the ways you overcome. Well, really good questions. We got a bit more to do in this unit, and we'll certainly do that next week. If you get a chance, there's a really good article. In fact, I was just looking at it. Just give me a moment. I realize we've run out of time. Just give me 1 second. see if I can bring this up. I was just looking at this article. One place you can go for really well-written articles is the Jewish Virtual Library. And there's an article that really gets you not just into Jewish thought, but really the study of this issue in ancient Near East. So it gets into Mesopotamia, Assyria, Babylon, Egyptian, as well as into Jewish thought. And then Jewish thought is broken down between kind of Hebrew Bible and later texts like apocalyptic writing. So this is an interesting article. Like I said, if you go to jewishvirtuallibrary.org, and that's where you would find this article. So it really is very detailed and gets into much more than we have time for. But at any rate, thank you for going a bit longer. I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen.
Shalom.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Yeah.